Hello everyone, welcome to another interesting and informative session of The Analyst brought to you by Vajiram and Ravi. In today's session, we will discuss 9 important articles as featured in the Hindu and Indian Express for your comprehensive understanding of the current affairs explained to you in the easiest language possible. The topics are as follows. From your analysis section, we'll be taking up two topics which we'll be discussing in depth. The first being an editorial on India's mineral ecosystem, and the second being the debate that whether the idea of one nation, one election is even feasible or not. Then, in your simplified section, we'll be taking up 7 news where we will try to simplify the news for you and also provide value enhancement for the same. So stay tuned. 16 September is celebrated as District Mineral Foundation Day as the Pradhan Mantri Khanij Kshetra Kalyan Yojana has actually entered into its 10th year or about to complete its a decade journey. Thus, the India's mineral ecosystem, which has actually featured in today's editorial, forms an important component of your GS1 paper under the theme of minerals and energy resources and under your GS2 paper with the theme of government policies and interventions. So, first let's try to develop a basic understanding that what are these minerals which will form the part of our discussion today. The minerals are basically the precious natural reserves which we have got, which basically act as a key raw material for the fundamental industries of the country which forms the backbone of our economy. The raw materials such as, for example, the iron ore, the manganese, mica, bauxite, the iron ore mines which we have got. From your prelims perspective, you guys can actually focus upon this map. If possible, take a screenshot. Just look at the important mines which we have got here, such as, for example, the iron ore mines of Mayurbhanj, Kendujhar, Bailadila, Chitradurga, Shivmoga, etc. Now, when we have understood that, okay, these are the minerals, let's have a quick overlook at India's mineral industry, where as per the data which has been provided to us by the Ministry of Mines itself, the number of reporting mines in our country stands at 1319, of which 545 are metallic. Metallic means gold, silver, iron, etc. and 774 of them are non-metallic, for example, mica, coal, etc. Also, as per the index of mineral production of mining and quarrying, its expansion from the base year stood at 139.6 in February 2024. Remember, it was actually 8% higher than the February 2023. Thus leading to the contribution of mining industry in India's GDP to be a staggering 82,680 crores, which is almost 5% of the GDP, providing employment to around 11 million people, and thus the mining sector is the second largest employer in the country, obviously after the agriculture sector, where around 46% of the country's population is actually employed. When we talk about the mineral production in the country, which states takes the lead? That is Odisha with almost 47% of our mineral production, followed by Chhattisgarh with 16%, Karnataka with 14%, Rajasthan with 11% and Jharkhand with 5%. Keep this in mind that these 5 states itself forms more than 90% of the mineral production in our country. When we have understood this, let's try to also see our ranking, that where we rank in the terms of production of these minerals globally. So in crude steel, we are the second largest producer. In aluminium, we are also the second largest. In lime, we are third. In iron ore, we are the fourth largest producer in the world. And in coal, we are the second largest producer. Also the second largest consumer after China. So when we are talking about these minerals, why these minerals, their exploration, excavation and uses in industry is so important? First is obviously because of the extraction of the critical minerals. These critical minerals are those minerals which has become essential or very important for the industry 4.0 with the increasing use of digitalization, the increasing use of technology and machines, right? So critical minerals such as, for example, lithium, cobalt or your rare earth elements, which are actually essential for the manufacturing of the semiconductors. So if you guys can recall, we were reading about the India's semiconductor mission. These semiconductors which are actually essential to create the chips which are actually making your laptop function, the laptop on which you are watching this lecture, the same chip which actually made us to land Chandrayaan 3 on the moon, making our country the fourth country in the world to achieve that feat, and the first country to land on the south pole of the moon. All of that is functioning on these semiconductors, and these semiconductors are made up of what? Of the minerals. Also, as a country, we are putting actually impetus on our energy transition, and thus we are putting impetus upon the renewable energy. Thus, under our production linked incentive scheme, we are actually trying to create more PV solar modules as well as electric vehicles. The idea is that even for that we will require these critical minerals. And why we are putting so much of impetus on this renewable energy? Because we want to achieve our Panch Amrit target. The Panch Amrit target to have 50% of the installed power capacity by the year of 2030 that shall be coming from the renewable energy, as well as to become a net zero emission country by the year of 2070. To achieve even this Panch Amrit target, we require what? These critical minerals. Thus, as per the International Energy Agency's Mineral Outlook Report of 2024, the demand of these minerals in our country, it actually rose by 30% in the year of 2023. However, when it comes to this mineral sector, we are actually facing a little bit of issues. The first of which is obviously that for several of such critical minerals, we are actually heavily import dependent, up to 100% import dependency for the lithium, cobalt and nickel. Even for graphite, we have around 60% of import dependency, and just look at the countries from where we are sourcing that, majorly from China actually. And what does this import dependency actually transpires to? So if we are actually doing a lot of import, that will actually lead to trade deficit. That basically means that we are depending on another country for our energy security. At the same time, such import dependency, such high trade deficit will lead to high current account deficit, and ultimately that can lead to the balance of payment crisis, the same issue which we were facing back in the year 1991. Also, the question arises here that okay, why we are so import dependent? The reason for that is the inadequate exploration and the tapping of the mineral reserves which we have in our country. So to understand that, we'll take an example of the ilmenite. Ilmenite is actually a very good source for titanium dioxide. And remember that in our country, we have around 11% reserves or deposits of this ilmenite. So obviously you might be guessing that, okay, so we are able to produce this titanium dioxide in our country? No. We almost imported $1 billion of titanium dioxide in the year of 2023 itself. The reason that we are unable to explore and tap the reserves of this ilmenite. So why? What are the reasons for this poor performance? So we'll take up a case study to understand that, and the case study will be of the lithium reserves which we found in the Riyasi, Jammu and Kashmir. So you guys might have heard very recently that we have kind of explored a lot of lithium reserves, right? It actually featured in a lot of headlines. Now, a very recent news of the June 2024 actually tells us that when these lithium reserves, which were actually searched by the Ministry of Mines, when that was put on the bidding, there existed a lack of adequate bidders. Why? Why the companies are not actually trying to get into these lithium reserves, try to explore them, extract them, and then use them to manufacture the semiconductors? Seems like a very viable, very potential business. The reason for that is, first, there exist two technological challenges. First is that there is not enough potential data or adequate data for the amount of reserves which actually exist there. So obviously you will not want to invest unless and until you know that yes, there is a lot of profitable venture. The second major technological challenge is that, let's say, this lithium reserves which we have found in Riyasi, that is actually in the clay deposit. And till now, the mineral extraction from such clay deposit has not been scientifically proven, not only in our country but in the world as well. So obviously, the most of the companies are actually avoiding it. Then just like lithium, there are several minerals such as for example gold, copper, all of them are deep-seated minerals and thus they require high capital from the beginning itself. And they have a long gestation period from their exploration to extraction to finally converting them to a product which is actually can be commercially viable, right? So this is such a long gestation period, and for that period you don't have any profit. You are not earning anything. That is why most of the companies actually deter from this investment, which basically deter the private investment in this mineral section, leading to the high dependency on the public sector units. Also, if we are so highly dependent on import and the private bidding is not taking place, the private participation is very less, that can actually lead to a strategic issue as well. Why? Because if we just look at the China's leading in the critical minerals production area, just look its dominance in copper, nickel, aluminium, leather, cobalt, rare earth minerals, etc. So most of the imports which we are doing is actually from China, obviously leading to the high current account deficit which we have with China, ultimately making us kind of dependent on China for these critical minerals. So basically we can term it in this way as well, that our energy security we are actually handing it to the China in the future. That we cannot do. So what the government has done, we'll move to that, but first before that just try to solve this prelims question on the discussion which we have. Right? Let's see if you got the hint and you were able to solve the question. Moving forward, what government has done? So the government has allowed 100% foreign direct investment under automatic route itself in exploration and extraction of these critical minerals. Then in January 2024, the India also signed a joint agreement with Argentina for the exploration of lithium blocks through this Kabil initiative which we have taken, right? Where we are taking exploration in the foreign countries. Remember that Argentina forms a critical part of the lithium triangle which exists, which are basically the three countries of South America which have got the highest number of lithium reserves. One I have already named. Can you guys name the other two in the comment? Let's see if you can complete the lithium triangle. Also, the government bought last year the Offshore Areas Mineral Exploration Bill 2023, where we will also try to exploit the mineral reserves which we have in the exclusive economic zone of our country as per the UN clause law. Then specifically the government bought the Mines and Minerals Act of 2023, where government said that earlier there were 18 atomic minerals, right, reduced down to 12. The government said that out of these 12 atomic minerals, 6 of the minerals, now even private sector can actually explore and can take up the charge for the mining. The 6 minerals such as for example lithium obviously being one of them, beryllium was there, titanium was there. So from the 18 minerals, now 6 minerals has been classified as critical and strategic mineral, and now they will be auctioned by the central government. Remember that the revenue from such auction will continue to accrue to the state governments and not central government. That is a salient feature of the act. Then the government said that okay, to further enhance the prospective stage exploration, it said that before bidding now it is allowed to drill and have a subsurface excavation. So you come and you see whether the potential exists or not. Also under the National Mineral Exploration Trust, the funding will be provided from grade 1 to grade floor explorations. Also now let's say if I have got a license for the exploration of the mineral. Okay, so let's say I have taken the bidding for the lithium reserves in Riyasi district. What the government is saying that now what is the area up to which I can explore? That is 1000 kilometer square. And if I found something viable there and I want to actually invest, then after the 3 years of time, I can actually hold up 25% of the area for the mining. Also, such mine owners can now sell 50% of their annual mineral, including the coal, in the open market for better price discovery. Now, let's try to understand what does the today's editorial actually emphasizes upon in this mineral sector. So it says that we shall provide a kind of a human touch to this mineral ecosystem, where it emphasizes upon the District Mineral Foundation which was created through the Mines and Minerals Act of 2015. under which the mining licenses and leaseholder, so I am mining in the Riyasi district, the lithium, so I am a holder. Now I will have to pay a royalty, which is basically a share of my profit, to this district mineral foundation. And that fund which is being collected, that shall only be used for one purpose, and that is for the welfare of the people affected by the mining. This DMF, District Mineral Foundation, in under this 3 lakh projects has been sanctioned till now, right, in 645 districts of 23 states. Also from 2015 to 2024, a corpus of 1 lakh crore has been created. The editorial obviously highlights that how September 16 is celebrated as the District Mineral Foundation Day because 10 years of completion of the Pradhan Mantri Khanij Kshetra Kalyan Yojana, right? Now, this DMF, District Mineral Foundation, is kept in the charge of whom? In the charge of the district collector, who is basically responsible for the flow of the fund, and this flow of funds shall only be given to the needy people in primacy. Also, the digitalization aspect is also there with the national DMF portal, which kinds of act as an oversight of the DMF across the country. And it has also establishes a dedicated engineering department and deputed states public welfare departments personnel in that. Also, there is a skilling initiative which has been taken. So for example, in Katni, Madhya Pradesh, the youths are actually being skilled in the drone technology, right? So that component is also there. So we can basically say that under District Mineral Foundation, a whole overall development is taking place of these mining affected areas. However, despite the claim of these editorials, let's have the assessment of this District Mineral Foundation. So, as per the recent report, which was actually published in Times of India, it states that the DMF projects which were sanctioned and has been completed, that is only 58% of the total project sanction. Let's take an example of Keonjhar here. Just see that how 11,540 projects were actually allocated. Now, the amount which was sanctioned from that was around 9,786, and the actually amount spent is actually 50% of the total amount which was collected in this foundation fund, right? So obviously the 100% utilization of this DMF is not being done, and that is something which we shall actually emphasize upon, right? So on the basis of this, try to solve a prelims question as well, and then try to attempt this mains question. We move forward to the next news. The central government has put impetus upon conducting one nation, one election in the current tenure itself. This idea of one nation, one election forms an important component of your GS2 paper under the theme of issues related to federalism and the government policies and its interventions. So before we try to discuss the whole idea of this one nation, one election, let's first develop a brief understanding about the election system which prevails in our country. There are 3 things which you need to keep in your mind. First is Article 324 of the Constitution, which actually establishes an independent election commission for free and fair election in our country. This free and fair election which actually forms the base of the electoral democracy kind of the government which we have adopted in our Constitution. The second is Article 326, which basically states that such election shall be taken place on the adult suffrage, and the definition of the adult was actually made down to 18 years from the earlier 21 years by the 61st Constitutional Amendment Act of 1989. Then all this conduct of election is actually regulated under the Representation of People Act 1951. So when we have developed a basic understanding that how elections are actually conducted in our country, this Election Commission of India, which is actually responsible for the conduct of election of both the Lok Sabha, which is the House of the People, as well as the State Legislative Assembly. So after this understanding, let's move to the idea of one nation, one election. Something which is actually being emphasized by our Prime Minister himself. The reason which has been given by him, that is that frequent polls are actually creating hurdles in the country's progress. So what is this one nation election? How it is going to act as a solution? The one nation election is basically a kind of a simultaneous election which shall be taken for Lok Sabha, state legislative assemblies, as well as your panchayats and the municipalities or urban and rural local bodies. So that is the idea. And as per the proposal by the Niti Aayog, such simultaneous election can take place in the two steps. The first step is to hold the Lok Sabha and the state legislative assembly elections together. Now, the today's article says that such holding of together election of a state legislative assembly and Lok Sabha will not require a ratification by the state, but it will require the amendment of the constitution. Let's try to develop an understanding that what does this actually means. Okay, so let's say that the Lok Sabha election is next due when? In the year of 2029. Now let's say that in the very same year there are 10 states which are also going to have their legislative assembly election. So what we can do? We can conduct the election for these 10 states and Lok Sabha at the very same time. So the problem is solved. But then there are 10 states whose elections are due in the year of 2028. 2 years prior to that or 1 year prior to that. So for what we'll need to do? We will need to extend their term till the year of 2029. Also, there are 8 remaining states which have their election in the year of 2030. That is 1 year after the election of 2029. So we need to curtail their term from the 5 years to the 4 years. However, there exists a constitutional article, that is Article 174. Article 174 states that no such state legislative assembly shall be dissolved before the completion of their term, and that is 5 years. So obviously, if you are extending the term or curtailing the term, the amendment of this article will be required. So you understand the amendment part. The first part was that ratification is not required. Why? Because when we will be amending this article under the Article 368 of the Constitution, under the amendment provision, then this provision of election rules actually falls within the central list. That is why the ratification of the state is not required in the first case. Now look at the second step which we need to take. What about the local bodies? So the Niti Aayog suggests that for the local bodies, the elections shall be synchronized in such a way that the local body elections will be held within 100 days of the elections to the Lok Sabha assemblies. Right? But now because the election of these local bodies fall within the state list of the 7th schedule, then you will require the ratification of half of the states, right? So let's say if there are 28 states, at least 15 of them shall agree. That is the idea, correct? So we have understood that how this one nation, one election can actually come into fruition. But the question which shall arise in your mind is that why? Why we actually need this one nation, one election? Everything is going fine, right? The idea or the argument for that, we will take the help of the B.S. Chauhan Committee of 2018, which actually lamented that the Indian polity has turned into a polity which is perennially or continuously in the elections. So for example, from the last year of 2023 to this year of 2024, there will take place 14 legislative assembly election and 118th Lok Sabha election which was recently concluded. And because of such polity, where the elections are taking place continuously, that leads to what? Disruption in the regular administrative and the development work. So, for example, if we need to conduct such election, there will be taking place the deployment of teachers, police officials, district magistrates. And because if they are doing this election work, obviously their work is actually overhauled and thus leading to the stoppage of the development work which they are responsible for. Also, in this election times takes place the policy paralysis, right? Because when the election takes place, just from where the campaigning actually starts, from that time period, the model code of conduct is issued by the Election Commission of India, the moment it releases the schedule. And from that time onwards, the government cannot launch any new scheme or cannot transfer any particular public servant or things like that. And because of that, there will take place an overhaul of the policy making. So for example, let's say a report comes of United Nations. It states that 10 million people are living in our country who are facing acute hunger. But just at that moment, the model code of conduct has come. So now the government cannot launch any new scheme to help these people. A policy paralysis has taken place. Then many of the government, because there is taking place such a perennial election throughout the years or over the years, they adopt a populist mode instead of a policy making mode. What do we mean by that? try to understand this. Let's say that I am a national party and I know that there is a state election which is about to take place. So obviously, instead of taking a long reformist approach where I actually try to bring a law to identify the creamy layer among the OBCs, as it was directed by the Supreme Court in the Indira Sahni judgment of 1992, instead of taking such long reformist policy, obviously I will take up a short-term approach or a populist approach where I will actually go in that state and I will also demand the OBC quota for a particular numerically strong community, right? So obviously the overall policies which can actually change or which is actually required by the nature of the economy at that point of time, that is not actually taken by most of the governments. Then there is obviously a showmanship versus statesmanship debate. What is statesmanship? Statesmanship is to actually realize that the power distribution companies, the power discoms, they are actually facing huge debts in your state. In some states, it is actually more than 1 lakh crore rupees. So we need to actually, try to help them. How to help them to actually increase the revenue somehow for these power discoms. But what is the showman or the kind of the showmanship which is actually adopted by the politicians, that they end up promising more freebies to the public, thus further endangering the position of these power distribution companies in their state. Then obviously, if there is an election which is taking place continuously, it can actually provide the greater scope for corruption because of the political pressure or the pressure lobbies which can take place. Also, such perennial election can lead to the high scale polarization of society because of the vote bank based politics, the division of the lines of region, religion, communalism, right? The kind of the hate speeches which are made by the politicians these days. Also, there is an economic angle which exists. If we look at the debate of Niti Aayog states that first of all, there is a massive recurring expenditure which is taking place because of such perennial elections and the deployment of forces as well. And it stated that if we'll conduct such one election throughout the nation, the cost will be around 4,500 crore versus the 3,870 crore which actually took place to conduct your 2014 Lok Sabha election itself. So obviously we can save on lot of the cost. And such single elections actually used to take place till 1967 because of the one party dominance at that time. But after the dissolution of certain state assemblies because of the imposition of precedent rule in 1968 and then in 1969 and then the dissolution of the Lok Sabha in 1970. So from there onwards, the disruption of this one nation, one election system took place. So it is actually suggesting that we shall revert back to it. However, there are certain counter arguments as well. First is obviously the constitutional challenges which we have seen. So obviously the kind of the extending or the curtailment of the terms which we'll need to do. For that we will need to amend the Article 85 and Article 174 of the Constitution. So that is going to be a challenge. Keep this in mind that currently we have a coalition government and this coalition government actually involves a lot of prominent state parties. So bringing such constitutional amendment will be a challenge for the current government. Then obviously let's say that such one nation one election system actually come into place. Now what happens that there take place passing of a non-confidence motion in a particular state. So obviously the government is dissolved, but after the dissolving of the government there is no such single party which can actually form the government. They don't have that much of the number. And let's say such one nation one election system came into fruition from the year of 2029. Such no confidence motion was passed in the year of 2030. So obviously the next election can only take place in 2034. So for next 4 years, what will happen? The precedent rule will impose under the provisions of Article 365. Obviously, because of that, it will ultimately lead to the undermining of the principle of federalism. Also, what happens that let's say there was a national party and this national party actually won the election in the Lok Sabha and then it bought certain policies. Those policies were actually not liked by the people. So when this same party will actually appear in the state legislative assembly, these people will not vote for them, thus ultimately giving a signal that we do not have resonance with your policies. However, such periodic accountability will actually be diluted because of this one nation, one election system. Also, it will be very difficult for the masses to actually understand which is a state party, which is a national party. When I am currently voting, I am voting for a state candidate or a national candidate. I am choosing my chief minister or my prime minister. And that difficulty can actually lead to the single party dominance. Just look at the data here. That when the such simultaneous election actually took place, the people, they ended up voting the same party only, right? See, in Andhra Pradesh, Congress, in Karnataka, BJP. So it is very difficult for the masses to understand. Also, there are certain roadblocks, such as, for example, in creating such a common voter list, right? Because the EC, it prepares the role for parliament separately and state separately. So obviously, the whole delimitation exercise will have to be taken place again. And creation of such a common role will actually require 500 crore rupees, right? Also, if look, to enable such a common electoral roll, all states will have to amend their respective laws to freeze the constituency boundaries to sync to a uniform calendar. Remember that the delimitation of constituencies is already frozen until 2031. So there are a lot of logistical issues which will actually be faced by Election Commission of India. Thus, we have to keep this in mind that when several states and political parties are actually opposing this one nation, one election. On the other hand, the Niti Aayog is actually stating that no, we shall actually adopt the fixed term parliament act like UK. We shall go forward this one nation election. So obviously, we know that there can exist an issue on the federalism. And whenever such question comes on federalism, always remember to write about the principle of cooperative federalism. So we shall address the interest of all the stakeholders in the country. All the issues which can arise or shall be taken into consideration. Here we can also enroll the Team India of Niti Aayog, right? And on the basis of the discussion, a kind of a model shall be created and then implemented. So try to attempt this particular question, which can appear in your mains examination, on the basis of discussion which we had, and we move forward to the next news. Now, a news today actually talks about that how there is a high level of gap which exists between the low skilled jobs which are actually declining and the high skilled jobs which are actually rising, right? Now remember that from these new sessions which we have actually tried to integrate a new approach where we will actually be trying to simplify the news articles for you, trying to read it in a very simple language. So please comment down that if you are actually liking this approach or not, and shall we move forward with this or not. Now coming to this particular article, before that, let's try to develop a basic understanding about the manufacturing sector of our country. So the manufacturing sector, all this data has been sourced from the Economic Survey of 2024. So Economic Survey 2024 states that the industrial gross value addition at a constant price by the manufacturing sector was actually 25% higher than the last year. The sector, if you look at the overall economy, it registered a growth of 8.2%, and that was actually riding on the industrial growth of 9.5%. The share of manufacturing in the total gross value addition was around 14%, and in GDP around 17%, employing thus 27 million workers. The export from this manufacturing sector actually stood at $447 billion. And if you look at the index of industrial production, it was around 143.5. That means 43% from the base year of 2011. Just look at this data here. Just look at the growth of manufacturing across the years, right? Also, if you look at the annual growth of industry, so we can see that from how kind of a negative growth in fiscal year 23, it actually is rising with 9.5% growth, right, in the manufacturing sector. Now, when we have understood this, let's try to understand that what does the today's article is actually stating. It states that in the last 2 years, the economic growth has actually primarily driven by the service sector. And there has been registered a huge decline in the low-skilled, labor-intensive industries, right? So obviously, at one hand, we are trying to skill our population through your Kaushal Vikas Yojana. But obviously, we cannot skill the whole of the population, right? Especially the people who are not in the young age bracket, right? So for them, actually, there is a requirement of a low-skill, labor-intensive industry as it is prevailing in the emerging countries like Vietnam and Bangladesh. But however, the job in this particular section is actually declining. Also, the idea was when we launched the Make in India, that we will take the contribution of the manufacturing sector in the GDP to 25% by 2025. However, the today's article says that how it has remained stagnant around 14%. The article says that how there are several companies who are actually opening the global capability centers in India, right? The country's manufactured weakness has caused it to fall behind Bangladesh in the areas of textile, Thailand in machinery, Vietnam in electronics, right? What are these global capability centers which we are talking about? So these are basically the one kind of tech solution areas which are actually being developed by various companies, such as, for example, if you look at IT, there is IBM, Dell. If you look at retail, there is Tesco, SuperValu, right? Or the offices of Google, Microsoft and Amazon, all of them forms the part of global capability centers. So these centers are rising, service sector is rising, but in comparison to that, the manufacturing sector is actually declining, and that is what the article is actually emphasizing upon. It states that how the economic survey 2023-2024 actually emphasized upon. At the same time, very recently, the deputy chief of IMF, Geeta, also said the very same thing, right? That India needs to create 7.8 million jobs annually in a non-farm sector. And in comparison to that, if you look at the report of the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy, it states that while we need to create this 7.8 million jobs annually, the CMI report is actually stating that the unemployment rate has actually increased and has reached to 9.7% in the June 2024 from the earlier 7%. Just look at the jobs which were created by the export related activities in India. Look how it has been on the consistent decline from the year of 2010 onwards. So obviously we are unable to create the jobs in the labor intensive sectors. Even if we are creating the job in this service sector, we have to keep this in mind that even though it contributes to more than 50% of the GDP of the country, with the gross value addition of around 53%, it employs only 28% of the people. While even though the contribution of manufacturing sector is less, it actually employs more people. Thus, the World Bank states that the export-related jobs are declining, as we saw. The direct employment linked to export has actually come down to 6.5%. Also, the service sector, if you look at the service sector's share in the world's commercial service exports of our country, that is 4.3%. In comparison to that, our contribution to the global goods market is standing at only 1.8%. Thus, just look at the rising high-skill jobs and the declining low-skill jobs. So that is a major problem for our country which we can face. So the article suggests that what actually the government has done in this regard to create such low-skill labor-intensive job. The first is obviously that in 2023, the government launched the Pradhan Mantri Mega Integrated Textile Resin and Apparel or PM Mitra Parks. Also, very recently we have covered in the analyst that how there has been setting up of 12 industrial smart cities under the National Industrial Corridor Development Program, right? The cities such as, for example, Khurpia in Uttarakhand, Patiala in Punjab, Jodhpur in Rajasthan, your Dighi in the region of Maharashtra, your Palakkad in the region of Karnataka. The article also actually suggests that what we can do is that we can create the global capability centers which are already proliferating in our country, and we need to actually double their numbers in the new IT policy. And we also need to transition from this business process outsourcing BPO industries to the manufacturing sector as well. So keep this issue, you guys can actually note down this diagram, it can become the part of your answer, and keep these suggestions and steps in your mind as well. We move forward to the next news. In this particular explained section of today's Indian Express, there is a very interesting debate which we are going to take place. The debate is that the article suggests that the food versus fuel debate that has now become old. Right? The food versus fuel debate, for example, we are actually trying to put impetus on electrical vehicles. So we are saying that we will actually divert a little bit of food towards the production of this biofuel. The food such as, for example, sugarcane, rice, maize, palm or soya bean oil. So that is a debate which we have in the mind. Now there has arisen a new debate, and this new debate is food versus cars. Why this debate has arisen? Because of the phosphoric acid. First, let's try to understand what is phosphoric acid. So phosphoric acid is actually manufactured from the rock phosphate after reacting it with the sulfuric acid. So now you guys might be aware about a kind of a fertilizer which we know called as diammonium phosphate. Remember that this diammonium phosphate is the second largest phosphate which we actually use in our country after urea. And this DAP, it actually contains 46% of the phosphorus which is actually required for the development of root and shoots of the plant. And this same phosphoric acid from which we are actually creating this DAP, this same phosphoric acid is also responsible to make LFP batteries, or the lithium iron phosphate batteries, which actually contributed to the 40% of the global electrical vehicle demand in the year of 2023. Now, what can be the impact of this on India? So obviously, we are heavily import dependent on China for this DAP. Keep this in mind. So China, remember guys, that it is actually the third largest producer of DAP, right? The first is Morocco, the second is Russia, and on the third number there is China. And we actually import a lot of this DAP from China. Now what happens is, first have a look of the imports of diammonium phosphate which we are doing. So just look from China, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, Russia, Jordan, etc. Also look at the top rock phosphate mine producers which exist in the world: China, Morocco, US, Russia, Jordan, etc. So now what happens that if, let's say that China starts actually developing a lot of these LFP batteries from this diammonium phosphate. So obviously it will divert this DAP towards its EV industry. Because of its diversion, there will be less DAP available which we can actually import from China. If we will not import that, there can take place a fertilizer shortage in our country. Because of fertilizer shortage, there can be low yield of the crops, and that can actually lead to our food security crisis because of the food shortage. That is what the article today is emphasizing upon. Now the article suggests that there are certain steps which India can take. First is that we have already taken. So when this DAP was actually being diverted by the China, its price actually rose very significantly in the market. What government did? So government actually promoted the farmers to start utilizing complex fertilizers, such as, for example, which actually contains nitrogen, potassium, sulfur in different combination. Then what it did, it actually kind of fixed the price of DAP at 27,000 per ton. However, the article today actually highlights that how let's say I'm a fertilizer company and I am importing this DAP. So when I'm importing this DAP, the cost which I am actually incurring is around 61,000 per ton. But after the subsidy which is being provided to me by the government, the price which is actually being paid by the farmers, after all of that, I am only getting around 54,000 rupees. So basically, I as a fertilizer company, I am incurring a loss of 7,100 per ton. That is why we need to increase, first of all, the MRP of DAP. Let's make it kind of, market oriented, right? Third is to remove the restrictions on the imports of DAP. That steps can also be taken. Also, we need to secure the supply of raw material through the overseas joint ventures and the buyback arrangements. One thing which is missing in the article and which we can actually suggest is to put impetus on organic farming, so we'll not require this fertilizer altogether under the Parampragat Krishi Vikas Yojana. So that is something which you guys can actually include in your answer as well. We move forward to the next news. Now we will discuss a very interesting but a little bit of complex article which has actually appeared in the today's Hindu, telling us about the amplitude, the frequency and the signal modulation. So we'll try to understand all of this with the help of a very simple story. The story is that let's imagine that you were actually sitting beside a lake, and just to pass the time, you actually drop a stone in that. Now this stone will actually create a ripple in this lake, right? Ripple in the water. So that will basically generate a wave, correct? Now remember that let's say if we drop a very heavy stone, then obviously the height of the wave will actually increase. So remember, this height of the wave is actually called as its amplitude. Amplitude is basically the distance between the origin and the crest or the trough of this wave, right? So obviously the high amplitude sound wave will actually be louder. A high amplitude light wave will actually be brighter, right? Now try to understand this, that if I start dropping number of rocks in that particular lake and you were sitting here on a boat, right? So obviously the frequency of these waves will actually increase because the ripples are increasing, correct? So the number of successive crests arriving at a spot is actually called as the waves frequency, which is actually measured in the hertz, right? So just look at the frequency. It is number of the waves that passes a point per unit of time. 1 hertz equal to 1 cycle per second. So that basically means that if the Chennai's Akashvani radio station is producing radio waves with 7,83,000 crests in 1 second, that is what they call as 783 FM or frequency modulation. The interval between the two successive crests or the two successive trough is actually called as the wavelength. So by this simple example, we have understood what? We have understood what is amplitude, what is frequency, and at the same time we have understood what is the wavelength, and this wavelength is actually measured in your meters, right? So keep this basic in your mind. Now we will try to understand that what is frequency modulation and amplitude modulation, right? So let's say that suppose we try to talk now from the Morse code, right? And we drop two stones in quick succession. One will be a dot, right? If I am dropping it in very quickly, that will be considered as a dot. And if I am dropping it with a longer gap, that will be called as a dash. Now when two stands, when they are dropped one after the other and the waves are very closely spaced, I can understand that it is of high frequency. If we drop the pebbles with a big time gap, then obviously the frequency of the wave will actually drop, right? Now, by monitoring the frequency of the incoming waves from the shore, what I can distinguish? I can distinguish that whether it is a dot, whether the stones are being dropped in quick succession or a longer gap is actually being taken. This is exactly what we mean by the frequency modulation. Here what we are modulating? We are modulating the frequency to transmit a message. The second is the amplitude modulation. Here what we do? Here we fix the frequency by dropping the stones at a fixed interval. So instead you change the weight of the pebble and thus there will be waves of different amplitudes. That will be called as amplitude modulation. Now what is a phase modulation, right? Let's try to understand that. So now what we can have both of the waves at the same times, right? We can have the two waves with the same frequencies but with different phases, meaning that one wave will actually start slightly later than the previous one, right? And we can actually regulate this modulation of the wave, right, with different frequencies and amplitude. What is the advantage of such phase modulation is that even the slight changes in the signal amplitude will not degrade the information which that wave was actually carrying. Why? Because the modulating signal is actually not transmitted by the amplitude of the pulse. So the pulse modulation, it is actually nearly impervious to any kind of amplitude fluctuation which is taking place, right? So that is why we use actually phase modulation. That is why the operators, they choose such phase modulation over the amplitude or frequency one, and that is exactly how your Wi-Fi actually functions in your home. Now another one simple concept, bear with me, that is what is digital, what is analog. So remember just a simple concept from this article, that is analog signals are actually continuous while digital signals are actually discrete. With this we have reached that what is or how the signal modulation can actually be used, right? So an important advantage of this modulation of the waves which we have been discussing, that is that multiple signals actually modulate differently, they can travel in the very same channel, right? So they have very little influence on a digital transmission thanks to the modulation which is taking place. This is why we have got the advanced communication technologies like the internet. Now remember that the International Telecommunication Union, it actually allocates the frequency bands to the different services to minimize the interference and increase the transmission efficiency, right? For this amplitude modulation, the frequency is actually very large, that is from 535 to 1705 kilohertz. So obviously that will lead to it passing from mountains and buildings. So obviously with amplitude modulation, because of the height, it will provide more coverage area. But at the same time, there will be technical disturbances in that proportion as well. So the frequency module, the FM, 97.3 FM bajate raho, right? That FM, it provides superior quality because it is unaffected by this static, right? That is why in your radio you actually hear to these FM channels, right? So we have understood this very interesting concept and we move forward to the next news. Now you guys might be actually reading in your internal security class about the issue of the left-wing extremism. The idea where a certain group of people actually believe in the Maoist ideology, that is to actually remove the state or topple the government through an armed rebellion. And very frequently you guys might be actually coming across various news where our Central Armed Police Forces personals are being killed by these Naxalites. Also you hear about their surrender to the government. So in this ongoing tussle, there has been several steps which our government has taken so far, right? For example, the government has launched a Samadhan doctrine. We have tried to actually bring the development in these underdeveloped regions under your aspirational district program. The government has also tried to increase the funding in the region through your special central assistance. The government has actually put a lot of focus on various kind of technologies, such as how to neutralize the internet explosive devices, IEDs, or how to use the drone technology to actually monitor this region. Also, we have launched the Eklavya Model School for the infiltration of the education in these regions, right? The effort of that can be seen with the shrinking red corridor, right? Where the districts which has actually added to the green list, which has actually left the left-wing extremism, just look at the number of districts which has been added, right? So we are actually trying to reduce down these red regions in our country, right? To reduce the left-wing extremism. The today's article also talks on the very same line, right? Where the central government has actually doubled the allocation of funds under the road connectivity project for the left-wing extremism affected areas, that is RCPLWEA, for the financial year of 24 to 25. Because as per our Minister of Home Affairs, the government is actually trying to completely eradicate left-wing extremism in the country by the year of 2026. Remember that this scheme for road connectivity is a separate vertical under the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana, right, which has actually been launched to in the regions of the 44 worst affected districts from the left-wing extremism. And under this scheme, the center and state, they actually share the expenditure in the 60-40 ratio, right, just like under the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana. Now, the article also suggests that how the Naxalism is actually declining in our country, that in 2010, there were around 107 districts from where such Naxalite issues were being reported, but now that has been come down to only 42. And there are still 9 states actually which are affected by this left-wing extremism. Their names has been given there. Just remember their location on the map. Right? Remember that to further increase the rural connectivity, the government has also increased the allocation under the Pradhan Mantri Janjati Adivasi Nyay Maha Abhiyan, or the PM Jan Man Yojana, which was launched very recently. Right? So keep these steps which has been taken by the government in the direction to curb down the left-wing extremism, and we move forward to the next news. The editorial in today's The Hindu actually puts impetus upon the issues which we are facing in the direction of the urban development. So the article basically highlights that how the country's urban population is increasing, because if we look at the data provided to us by Niti Aayog, the population is actually going to increase up to 40%. So the 40% of our country's population will actually be living in urban areas. By which year? By the year of 2030 itself. Right? So the demography is actually changing, specifically in your tier 2 and tier 3 cities as well, also in the peripheries of the major urban centers and urban agglomerations. So the article basically highlights the various policies which the government has taken for the urban development, right? Obviously, three you guys can actually recall. You can also use in every mains answer which you are writing. So one is your Swachh Bharat Urban. The second is your Amrut Yojana. The third is your Smart Cities Mission, right? The three basic schemes. So let's say what article actually has to say about that. The article says that how there is actually taking place the over centralization of finance in the recent time. And this was actually the issue which was also highlighted by the 13th Finance Commission as well. Because many of these financial grants which shall actually be diverted toward these urban local bodies, they are actually not done so because of the tied nature of their grants linked to any centrally sponsored schemes, right? Not leading to their financial devolution. Right? Such as, for example, there is a Swachh Bharat Mission, the Atal Mission for Rejuvenation of Urban Transformation, or Amrut, right? Under which the government is actually trying to put a lot of impetus on household tap water connection for 100% coverage of household sewerage and septage management in 500 Amrut cities, right? Now let's see that what are the issues according to this particular editorial today. The editorial says that the findings which has been, the kind of the fundings which has been proposed under the Amrut, it initially covered 500 cities. But now it has actually extended to all statutory towns. But as per the editorial, these towns accounts for only a portion of the urban population. Why? Because many of the people, they actually live in census town. The census towns which has actually a minimum population of around 5,000 and in more than 23,000 urban villages which are actually not classified as statutory towns, and thus they cannot have access to the funds under the various schemes, right? Now it states that when urban infrastructure for a liquid waste, such as for example sewage treatment plant is actually designed, the funding is sought under Amrut in these contagious areas do not qualify for the funding. Why? Because for that we have got a separate initiative, and that is Swachh Bharat Mission Urban, right? So Niti Aayog has pointed out that 90% of the Kerala is actually urban, and in such a situation, Amrut grants cannot be utilized to create infrastructure in this particular region, right? Thus, why? The reason being that obviously it falls under the Swachh Bharat Mission, right? Which is now the Swachh Bharat Mission, the 2.0, correct? And the article also states that if we have got the same aims, right? The same aims for Swachh Bharat Mission Urban and Swachh Bharat Mission Rural, right? That is obviously to go beyond being the open defecation free, to focusing on making urban India garbage free as well, and also proposing sustainable solutions and practices for waste management. So the article says that if both of these two has the same aims, why we are not converging them, right? Because obviously such converging will actually lead to yield better results, right? The next argument which it actually makes is that it offers us several governance models, right? Because it states that the framework which was actually established by the 73rd and 74th Constitutional Amendment Act of 1992, establishing the urban and urban local bodies and the panchayats, that actually needs to be strengthened. And it also suggests that the district planning committees, which actually comprises of Jila Panchayats and urban local bodies, that need to be strengthened and mobilized as well, right? So remember the issues with the Amrut, remember the suggestions which has been provided by today's editorial. We move forward to the next news. An explained article in today's Indian Express talks about a very interesting concept of commons. What are commons? What are the rules and provisions to regulate these common resources? So let's have a look at that. By understanding first by common, what we mean is that it basically refers to resources that are not owned, keep this in mind, by any individual, any group or government, but rather it actually belongs to a kind of a shared principle to the community as a whole. So do public park falls in the commons, right? Just give me the answer, right? Just by the definition, correct? Now the commons can actually be intangible too, right? So when we are saying commons, we are saying that commons are basically the rivers, right? The river Ganga or the sacred sites. In urban setting, it can be actually parks and lakes actually, which are not actually controlled by the government, do not belong to the government. It can also be actually intangible in the form of a folk art, right? For example, the Yakchagan theatre of Karnataka, right? It can be any local custom or the traditional knowledge. So all of that falls in the category of commons. Keep this in mind that at an international level, the polar regions, such as for example Arctic and Antarctic, they are considered as global commons. Also, the outer space, the moon, the planetary bodies, they are also global commons, right? So for example, we were discussing about the landing of Chandrayaan 3. So all countries landed there, right? It's not like that China is like, no, the moon is ours. They cannot say that. So it is obviously falls in the category of commons, right? Now, since no one owns common, it actually creates a problem. The problem is the responsibility of maintenance and keeping, right? So like for example, who will manage the debris pollution which is taking place in the space, right? Who will regulate that? Correct? That is the issue. Now the article suggests that there are certain agreements which are like in the direction of regulating this common, such as for example the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, right, which seeks to maintain a livable planet for everyone, correct? In urban areas, the municipalities or other bodies of local governance actually take place of the commons, like a public park, correct? The local communities, they do get involved, but in most cases they lack the resources or the legal sanctions to actually manage these common spaces, right? Now there is the issue. The issue is that if no one is actually regulating these common resources, what will take place? The over exploitation of it, right? And that over exploitation can actually lead to what? The tragedy of the commons, a term which was actually popularized by the ecological economist Garrett Hardin, right? So the idea is that anyone, at least the government or the market, shall be involved in the regulating of these commons, right? However, there is another research, a research by Elinor Ostrom, the research which was actually published in the book called as Governing the Commons, right, where she states that the intervention of neither the government nor the market is actually required to deal with the commons. The explained article also gives us the idea of Forest Rights Act, which was enacted in the year of 2006, which actually recognizes the right of the people living in these forest areas. So the forest can be considered as common. So we also have a law to actually regulate these common resources? Yes, we do have. That is the Forest Right Act, right? Remember the important information which has been actually provided today, that is almost 25% of our country's landmass, that is around 205 million acres of area, it is estimated to be commons, right, comprising of the community forest, pastures, water bodies, and about 350 million rural people, they actually depend on these commons for their livelihoods. The commons are also estimated to generate an economic value worth of 6.6 lakh crore, right, annually through the provisions of various goods and ecological services. So keep this in mind. We move forward to the last news of the day, where we'll be discussing about the GST Council. The GST Council, which is basically a constitutional body under the Article 279A of the Constitution. So with your 101st Constitutional Amendment Act of 2016, the Goods and Services Tax was actually brought into the force. The same act also created or inserted an article in the Constitution called as 279A, which actually empowered the President to appoint a GST Council. Right, so the GST Council is actually created by whom? Created by the 101st Constitutional Act of 2016 by the President, right? Now this council is actually chaired by whom? Who serve as the president of this GST Council? So that is our Honorable Finance Minister, and it also contains the Finance Minister of various states as the members. Remember that it actually decides on the various tax slabs of the GST, which has been in the news for certain reasons, if you guys know. And when we are talking about these tax slabs of GST, any such decision, right, has to be taken by a 3/4 of the majority. That means at least 75% of the majority. Now the states has got the equal share of vote, that is around 66%. But just because the central government has got 33% of the vote share, that means that they have got a virtual monopoly. Because the moment they will agree, it will never come down to 75%, and thus whatever the center will say, that will only happen. But is that true? No, because Supreme Court in 2022 ruling actually held that the decision of the GST Council is not binding on the state governments. So keep this in your mind. With this, we have reached to the end of our discussion today. Do not forget to attempt the questions at the end of the video and test your knowledge. We will meet in a very interesting discussion very soon. Till then, all the very best for your preparation, and thank you.